My name is Katya Arifin, and I'm a high school journalist from Toronto, Ontario. This interview was with Faith Fundal, a CBC journalist and podcast host. We discussed 2SLGBTQ plus voices in high school journalism. Faith was working for CBC Prince George at the time, and they're the host of They and Us, a podcast which shares the stories of people navigating the world of pronouns, trans rights, and the quest to be recognized for who they are. People like Harper Perrin, who we mentioned in the interview. On the podcast, Harper discussed the discovery of their gender identity and how they interact with the world as a non-binary person. And Faith has said that through the making of that podcast, and because of stories like Harper's, they began to use non-binary pronouns. Their experience of using journalism to discover more about themselves gives them a unique perspective on queer storytelling, which we thought would be really helpful to student journalists. It was a real honor to speak to them. Please enjoy. Hi, Faith.
Hello there.
So just to get started, in your opinion, what is the importance of having a greater and more diverse LGBTQ plus perspective in high school journalism?
You know, when we think about journalism and when we think about the stories that we capture, having a diverse, a place where you have diverse folks can only mean that you will have diverse points of views and diverse material in the end. And so I think it's important to be able to have these different points of views and different lived experiences, to be able to share those stories, because as a lot of people who I've met know, you know, you sort of experience life in your own way, and someone who's not experienced the way that you've experienced life may not typically appreciate what you've gone through. So yeah, I think it's important to have that diversity.
How do you think once these student publications have this diversity within their schools, how do you think they can use their platform to promote it?
From what I've learned, the more I talk about these experiences, the more stories I share to help people better appreciate the context of queer folks and non-binary and other folks, the more people who listen or read better understand, and that just sort of continues. So I think as high school students write these types of stories and share those experiences, I think it just you'll continue to be able to better help your audience better understand people.
And you mentioned that you are the host of They and Us, a CBC podcast, and as a current affairs journalist, I really wanted to get a sense of your process when approaching these kinds of experiences. Let's say that you're telling a story about 2S LGBTQ plus person, and you want to represent them accurately. So what do you take into consideration when you're doing that?
You know, first, I mean, of course, having a conversation with them, and I would probably say something like, I have not, so in my case, I have only met one two-spirit person, and so I would probably say something like, I'm still learning, and please forgive me if I say something inappropriate, and please let me know, because I want to make sure that I'm reflecting your experiences in a way that is true to your lived experiences. So starting off with being clear about expectations. My expectations as a journalist, and then checking with them about their expectations of what they hope to take from your conversation. I think sort of getting on the same page is the first thing. And then just allowing that conversation to happen, just being curious about the things that you ask, and when you trust your gut as a journalist, because usually when you go, oh, that's really interesting, but it might not be the next question on your page, ask about that, because there's a reason why you think it's interesting, and I would trust that and explore that. And once you have everything, write the things that you remember after that interview, because those are probably the most important things. Don't listen to the entire thing again, at least unless you can't think of anything that's really important. And then you write your story, and you ask yourself, if you are saying something in a story, you ask yourself, well, how do I know that? So if someone says there is no racism in the school, of course, no one, I don't think anyone would say that, but if someone says that, then you ask the question, well, how do I know that there is no racism? And sort of explore that, because you want to make sure that whatever you're writing about is as accurate as you can make it.
In researching your work and your career, your rise within the journalism industry is very interesting, and it's honestly quite inspiring. So I just wanted to get a bit of your experience and your history. So as a genderqueer person, how did you yourself make space for yourself within the CBC, for example?
No, thank you so much for saying that. I'm honored that that's how you feel. I you know I am still figuring it out. Um, I, really, I'm still figuring it out. And so when I first decided to come out here while working for CBC as someone who is bisexual, it wasn't really a coming out. It was kind of just like I just told one coworker, and that was it. And then I started talking about I started bringing that perspective as I told stories, and it kind of that's kind of just how it was. I first discovered or came to the realization that I was bisexual. Then I later learned pansexual was a word that would work better for me. Um, and it wasn't until I heard from, I spoke with Harper Perrin, who is one of the folks on the podcast. They're describing their experiences that it made me think, wait a minute, that sounds just like the things that I feel, or the things that I think about, the things that are important to me. It wasn't until then that I realized, you know what? I think the language that's been missing in my life is this, that I identify as a non-binary person or a queer person, depending on the context. Um, so that's it's kind of that's just how I got here. I'm still figuring it out, and I continue to be curious, and I take that approach in the podcast as well, because I, I don't know everything, and as folks who listen, there's no judgment about how. Guess what? It's 2020, and you should know what non-binary means. It's not about that. It's about how we hear stories from folks. And if you don't know, well, it's okay, because I also don't know, and I'm figuring it out. You can figure it out with me.
Do you think that there's maybe a unique perspective that you've brought to all your work because of your identity?
I think so, and I think it's something that a lot of folks, I talk about how these are my experiences, so they're unique to me, and other people will have their own unique lived experiences. Other high school journalists, right? And in thinking about your context and how that sort of where you place or where your experiences place in the bigger world, I think that's important to reflect on, and try to unpack. Um, like I said, I wouldn't have known, or maybe it would have taken me longer to realize I was non-binary if I didn't hear from Harper Perrin. If maybe I don't know, but I do know is that when I heard about their experiences, and because we told um, a, a story, or shared story from someone who we never ever hear from, that's what allowed me to sort of figure it out. And I would encourage other journalists to just keep telling the stories that you find and that you think are important to tell.
Mhm. For queer high school journalists who are maybe interested in going into the field as post secondary education or even just going straight into work, what kind of environment do you think that they're going to be coming into, and how has that changed from what you came into as a starting off point?
Yeah, we're right now. I have noticed that we're in a world where we're much more aware of how the system that we have in place um, is racist or can be racist. And so I how we see our context as journalists now, I think is very different from how we may have seen, or at least how I saw myself as a journalist 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. So I think as we're at a point where things are changing, or at least people recognize that things need to change. And so I'm hopeful that as student journalists, high school journalists, go to school and become start to work for places like CBC, that it will be a place that is inclusive and diverse, and you can be yourself.
And on that note, I just want to say thank you so much for sitting down with us. Your candid answers and were so in depth, and I believe they'll be really helpful to queer journalists and even just their allies looking to represent more voices in their publications.
And thanks so much for inviting me to come on. When you asked, I thought, oh, I don't know what I can provide. So I'm glad to hear that there are folks out there, and organizations like yours that talk about becoming journalists, because it's a really fascinating field, and the things that we do can lead to change and make a big difference. So I'm glad that there are other folks who are interested.
Definitely is. My name is Katya Arifin, and this has been an episode of On the Record, a video series by the Canadian Youth Journalism Project.